about a 3-minute introduction, but we'll run it behind, so I'm going to spill. Carey, author of Tennessee History. Bill, come on up.
There you go. Couple of interesting things in my resume. Do any of you get Tennessee Magazine from the Electric Co-op? I've been writing the history column for Tennessee Magazine for 17 years. I know I started at like and also I've written 7 books about Nashville history, one of which is called Fortunes, Fiddles, and Fried Chickens. It was a big hit when it came out 20 years ago. And I started a nonprofit organization called Tennessee History for Kids. And the main thing we do is try to help public school teachers teach social studies. And I was telling Roy, 99.9% of what you hear in the media is wrong about it. Believe me, teachers are teaching a lot of social studies. What you hear on talk radio is just all complete stuff with makeup. We get people to listen to talk radio. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and get started. This is my latest book, and the reason I thought it might be of interest is because it's a lot of Murfreesboro history that I don't think anyone's ever dug up before now. And this book focuses on changes in Tennessee that took place between 1811, when the New Madrid earthquakes hit. There were about 2,000 of them, until 1854, when Nashville was first connected to the outside world via railroad. This was 43 years. Among the major changes that happened during that 43 years, one is the arrival of the steamboat. And there were 3 different arrivals. There was the arrival in what we now call Memphis, which wasn't called Memphis yet. There was the arrival 6 years later in what is Nashville. And then there was the arrival in Knoxville, which was last, because it took them so long to get the boats past the Muscle Shoals and past the Suck. Y'all know what the Suck was? The Suck was a really important place in Tennessee history. Just downstream from Chattanooga was an area where boats couldn't get through because the water moved so fast. It's called the Suck. And if you've never heard about it, then that's too bad, because Johnny Cash did a song about it. You know that? Johnny Cash knew his Tennessee history. Nashville became the state capital. And this definitely affected Murfreesboro, because, as I'll tell you in a second, Murfreesboro had been the state capital, and Murfreesboro fought like, hardly expressed in hell, to get the state capital. In fact, I'm going to tell you a couple of quotes here. Y'all know what that is? Yeah. Okay. Hollow Rocks, here in Murfreesboro, to prove this is the center of the state. Well, there was a state senator named Henry Sneed, S-N-E-E-D. The community of Sneedville in Hancock County is named from him. He represented Rutherford and Williamson counties. And what happened, they spent like a week arguing about where the state capital is. Every town had their state representative get up and say, I represent the good people of Clifton, Tennessee. This is the reason Clifton should be the state capital. And then they would vote and they would lose. And then Sparta would go, and then Knoxville would go, and then Taylorsville, which is now known as Johnson City, would go. And it went on and on. Finally, it came down to Nashville versus Murfreesboro. Well, Sneed was representing this area, and among the things he said to try to get people to pick Murfreesboro over Nashville, he said the people of Nashville are the creditor class. They are traders, speculators, while the largest portion of the people elsewhere are farmers. The interests of the 2 classes are averse, and their opinions, of course, are at variance. He also made reference to Nashville's voluptuousness and dissipation. And then he said that the citizens of Nashville were bribing the legislature by offering them free land, which is a curious point, because Murfreesboro was also offering the legislature free land. Anyway, they finally, after a week, they voted to put it in Nashville. And the other thing they pointed out is that they had figured out exactly where they had hired a mathematician to figure out where the geographic center of the state is. Are any of you math majors like me? You could have just took a map of the state and drawn 2 lines. You didn't need to hire a mathematician, but they hired a mathematician, and that's it. I'm sure all of you had your pictures of me. Okay? The next big thing, people forget about this. The telegraph. The telegraph arrived in Tennessee. I have a whole chapter in the book about it, which I'll be selling both at the end of it. I have a whole chapter in the book about it because no one had ever dug up the first telegraph message ever sent to Nashville. And so I went to the newspapers.com and found, been digging and digging, and then I went back and forth and I finally triangulated. But when the telegraph arrived, you got to realize how important this was. Before the telegraph arrived, it took 3 or 4 weeks for news to make its way from New York, Philadelphia, or Washington, D.C. to Nashville. As soon as the telegraph arrived, it took like a day. So, you know, we all know, I suppose, that the reason the Battle of New Orleans was fought was because the news didn't make its way to New Orleans at the peace treaty was signed. Well, contrast that to July 3rd, 1863, and I'm not making this up, when the Tennessee and when the Republican Banner newspaper actually had a story that said that there appears to be evidence that there's going to be a major battle near a town called Gettysburg. I was shocked as well. I was like, I didn't know that this would even happen. But that's how good the telegraph, how much it changed the world. Well, the telegraph came in 1848, and I have a whole chapter in the book about it. And by the way, if you want to hear a longer version of this, I'm speaking at the State Library on Friday. And it's like the hour-long version of this 15-minute presentation. The other thing that changed is before 1850, this is how we got around. When you hear the word stagecoach, what do you think of? You think of Bonanza and Ponderosa. Well, this is, if you look carefully here, this is the Nashville to Ashland City stagecoach. Now, I got news for you. I assume that this was, they were posing for a picture, because as soon as those horses take off, these guys are going to fly up the back. Okay, this is how people got around. And by the way, it took, according to the newspaper and according to the ad, it took 2 days and 2 hours to get from Nashville to Knoxville. 50 hours. And that's what the ad said. Imagine how much it really took. That's how long it took to get on stage. You know, this is what the, you know, so but this is what life was like. People didn't go on vacation. People didn't go very far. You know what their idea of a vacation in this community was? Go to Jefferson, Springs. Yeah. That's how far people went for vacation. I'm doing another book on the resort hotels. And there's one here called Jefferson Springs. And that's what you did. You went to the river and you kind of waded out to the heartland of the Sims River. That's what people did. They didn't go very far because they couldn't get far away. But the biggest thing I want to focus on is this. The first railroad to open in Tennessee was the one that connected Nashville to Chattanooga. And which brings me to the main topic of the day. Okay, before 1850, Nashville was a river town. As far as products and produce were concerned, everything that left or came to Nashville came by flatboat before 1820 and steamboat after 1820. The town was completely dependent on the Cumberland River and to a lesser degree on the stagecoach companies. That's how the mail got there. Okay, everything changed with the creation of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railway. Okay, the story starts around 1845. There was a state senator named James Overton, and there was a newspaper editor who had multiple, his name was A.O.P. Nicholson, and they began organizing support for a new railroad to connect Nashville to Chattanooga. Now, the idea, there was not a railroad in Tennessee yet. The idea was that the state of Georgia and the government of the state of Georgia was building a railroad to connect what is now called Atlanta. It didn't have a name yet. It was called, you know what it's called then? What was the original name of Atlanta? Terminus. It's called Terminus. And they connected Terminus to the Mississippi, to the Tennessee River. Originally, they were connect Terminus to the Mississippi River at a place called Gunnersville here. But they finally decided, okay, we're going to connect it here because they could already tell that they were going to build a railroad down from Nashville. Known as the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, it would give Middle Tennessee farmers access to Atlantic coast markets, plus give Nashville access to untapped coal reserve in southeast Tennessee. It would also mean that the produce of Middle Tennessee would make it to the open sea in about 1/5 the cost and about 1/10 the time. Think about those calculations: 1/5 and 1/10. Be like finding out you can get to Knoxville in 20 minutes. Well, I think I'll do that. Anyway, this is Stevenson. Anyway, In 1845, Overton and Nicholson convinced the General Assembly to grant their railroad a charter and give it a power of eminent domain and to exempt it from taxation for 20 years. So it was exempt from taxation until 1865. Nothing important is going to happen in 1865, right? They hired Nashville businessman Vernon K. Stevenson to raise money for the project, and he became president of the railroad. This is a slide I'm sure you all wish you could see, and I'll be glad to email it to you if you want me to. Stevenson went town to town selling stock in the new venture. And in the fall of 1847, he raised money in small communities throughout Middle Tennessee. Jefferson, Bond Store, Milton, Ready Store, Middleton, Murfreesboro, spelled the old-fashioned way, Unionville, Richmond, Big Spring, something store, Triggs Mill. Y'all recognize all these names? Some of you might, some of you probably don't, but a lot of these names don't exist anymore. But they literally went door to, like, town to town. And we'd love to hear a recording of all the things that were said. But remember, also, some of these places invest a lot of money in the railroad in the community. Some of them might not have, and if you didn't, you might not get the railroad to your town. In the end, the governments, a lot of people did invest in the railroad, but not enough. So what happened in the end is that the governments of Nashville and Charleston, South Carolina, Charleston was a really big place then, ensured the project's success by investing more than $500,000 each. By the way, this investment by Nashville's government was without precedent, and it was challenged and upheld by the state Supreme Court. In case you're wondering, when did we start corporate welfare? We started in 1848. That was the day it was considered fine to invest money in the railroad. Seriously, before that time, no one could imagine it would happen. Okay, this is the route that the railroad took. You can kind of guess where we are here. What happened was surveying crews began laying out the rail line in 1847. Since the straight line between Nashville and Chattanooga crossed the Cumberland Plateau at a very steep place, the engineer chose a 152-mile route through Rutherford, Bedford, and Franklin counties and into northeast Alabama, where it turned sharp east at the Tennessee River and headed to Chattanooga from there. Okay, have you ever seen this before? You can find this on the internet. This is the map of the Encino Railway by like 1900. Anyway, several towns. Okay, if you look at this map, you can see where the stops consisted of. But here's Glencliff, a place called Asylum. That's right. Antioch, Mountain View, Kimbrough, Smyrna, Wade, Florence, Murfreesboro, Winstead, Rucker, Christiana. Heard of Christiana. But this is all the stops that were on the way. Several towns that didn't exist before this time were created through this process, including Tullahoma. This is an ad for you want to buy land? Let's buy land in the new town of Tullahoma. Let's move there. Deckard, which was named for a railroad engineer, a railroad executive, in a place called Cowan, Tennessee. And then Stevenson, Alabama, which is named for guess who? Mr. Stevenson, and Bridgeport, Alabama. This is, in the old days when they announced towns, they ran ad after ad saying, oh, everybody buy land in the new town of Tullahoma. It's going to be the greatest place in the world. No, it's not going to be the greatest place in the world. Deckard is going to be the greatest place in the world. So these towns would have fights. Move here, no, move here. Anyway, the construction project included a 2,200-foot tunnel through the Cumberland Mountain in Franklin County. Have y'all ever seen this tunnel before? You're not supposed to go back there now. I think CSX would like take a shot at you if you do. A friend of mine took this picture. I didn't have the courage to do it. The tunnel was dug by hand, pick and shovel. The most technologically advanced thing at the disposal of the workers who dug it was dynamite. If there were people in Nashville who didn't understand the magnitude of this project, they definitely understood it on December 14, 1850. That's when a steamboat called the Beauty hauled a locomotive to Nashville. So the first locomotive that came to Nashville came on a boat. Okay. Can you imagine? Now, here's my question. How did they get the locomotive from the riverfront to the train track? Mules were the real heroes in early Tennessee history. Mules did everything. Okay, like I'm sure this is like I bet we won't get credit for this. Yeah, obviously, this is the first locomotive that anyone had ever seen before. Along with the locomotive, the steamboat brought 13 freight cars and 1 passenger car. I would like to have seen a picture of this steamboat while I get into all this stuff. Anyway, mules, this is a story I found a few years ago. I actually found this in advance of my first book 20 years ago. A lot of people, when I post this, and like the State Museum has it as if they kind of knows me. Mules dragged the locomotive, freight cars, and passenger cars to the Nashville and Chattanooga terminal. In the spring of 1851, the train made its first trip, an 11-mile jaunt to Antioch. No one had ever heard of it before. It was a glorious and exciting day for Tennessee state capital. Only the important and the well-connected got to ride on that first train. So that was definitely the most important day in the history of Antioch. I don't think people get that excited about Antioch quite at that time. Okay, now speaking of Antioch and Murfreesboro, the railroad, what happened is they did like 10 miles and then 10 miles. It was like a, working along the way. By July 4th, they made it to Murfreesboro, and there was a celebration dinner attended by 4,000 people. Now I'm going to ask y'all a question. Did this Rotary Club have anything to do with this dinner? Because there's a problem here. I found this ad a few days ago. They basically ran an ad in the newspaper and invited all the citizens of Davidson County to come to Murfreesboro for a public dinner to be given by the citizens of Rutherford at Murfreesboro on the 4th of July. They invited the whole town in a newspaper ad. What can go wrong, right? There were 4,000 people here, so I think there would have been slightly more food than y'all have every week. 4,000 people. This is definitely one of the bigger days in Murfreesboro history. Meanwhile, there were and by February of 1852, the railroad made it to Tullahoma, and we were in that weird period where you could get to Charleston, South Carolina, in only 53 hours by taking the railroad from Nashville to Tullahoma, and then taking the stagecoach from Tullahoma to Chattanooga, and then the railroad from Chattanooga to Charleston. This was a phase that existed for a while. There were a couple of these. Meanwhile, they're building railroads to Memphis and other. And there were a few times where you can see, okay, you have a journey where you go boat and then railroad and then stagecoach. You might or may not make it a lot. Meanwhile, there were stories about how property values were going up near the railroad, stories about businesses that were on the rise because of the railroad, stories about how railroads were moving products to Nashville, such as coal, and everybody was just loving the railroad. But, a lot of the enthrallment and publicity peaked in March of 1851, when the tunnel through the Cumberland Mountain was complete. This is an item that was published in the Buffalo, New York newspaper about the tunnel in Franklin County near Cowan, Tennessee. So this is a really big PR coup for Tennessee. So, but meanwhile, I need to point out a few things that we kind of forget about. Like every railroad built in the South, the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad was built by people who weren't paid very much, certainly by modern standards, who risked their lives and helped more than American workers today, and in some cases were enslaved. This is an ad that ran in many of the Tennessee newspapers for several years during this process. Let me translate it here. We need 2,000 workers. 1,000 of them are Irish laborers. Why? The Irish knew how to build railroads. They know how to blow things up. Okay, they did. There were, at that time, y'all remember what was the place in New York where people would become citizens and get off the ship? No. That was in the 1880s. That's not where my family came from. Castle Garden. If your family came to this country before the Civil War, they didn't go to Ellis. They went to Castle Garden. I just thought I'd point that out because I didn't know that either. I was like, wow. The Castle Garden is also more people came to Castle Garden than came to Ellis. But anyway, so they had people with signs that say, come to Tennessee, work on the railroad. It'd be great. Irish workers just, okay, we need about 1,000 of them. Okay, keep going. Okay, 500, let me jump to this, 500 Negroes. What does that mean? Does that mean slave Negroes or free Negroes? It does not, it means enslaved. There were, first of all, there weren't enough Negroes to fill those jobs. But no, this means slaves. So this was appealing to people who held slaves. And you could farm out your slaves to the railroad and they would work and you would get paid the money that otherwise they would get paid. Now, this is the most curious thing of all. What is a native born laborer? Yeah, somebody who doesn't happen to be in the other two categories. Just some guy who happens to not be a Negro, not be a Negro slave, and not be an Irish slave. So, in other words, in 1840, 1850, 3/4 of the jobs that the railroad was bringing, only 1/4 went to people who were not slaves or immigrants. If y'all think that this is new, the anti-immigrant thing, you're wrong. Because, the railroad, I mean, we don't want, we only want 500 of you guys who are from here. Anyway, and along with I mentioned the Irish laborers. Some of the people who worked on the railroad were professional engineers who had been trained in colleges, such as West Point. But by the end of 1852, the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad had hired at least 100 enslaved people to lay track, repair track, and do general maintenance between Murfreesboro and County. Meanwhile, a private contractor called Murdoch and Townsend advertised that it needed to hire an additional 500 slaves to work on the line on the Tennessee River Bridge in northeast Alabama and Chattanooga. That stretch included an especially large amount of blasting and moving of rock, for instance, where the railroad wound around Lookout Mountain, and still does. These enslaved people were sent away from their families and households and leased to the railroad for months or even years. The railroad might pay the slave holder around $150 a year for their labors. The enslaved people would be clothed and fed at the railroad's expense and would sleep in tent-like quarters near where they would work. There are no photographs of these. Meanwhile, there appear to have been more immigrants working on the railroad than slaves. The Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad hired hundreds of Irish immigrants the moment they got off the ship at Castle Garden, New York, and sent them straight to Tennessee. Far away from their homeland, sometimes the immigrants had too much to drink after hours. There were a lot of articles about riots involving the Irish laborers near Winchester / Cowan. And okay, this is the most bizarre of all, but I'm just going to read this. On Sunday night, a general fight took place at the tunnel between the natives and the Irish. A bad feeling had existed for some time between the two parties, and on Sunday night, having taken a sufficient quantity of rot gut whiskey to arouse their worst passion, a fuss was raised, and a general fight was the consequence, in which several men were badly used up, but fortunately no one killed. The natives in the end proved too strong for the Irish and succeeded in driving them from the hill. What hill? They then armed themselves and swore that if an Irishman would dare show himself, they would take his life. They then destroyed a great deal of plunder belonging to the Irish. Blah, blah. And all this was happening kind of in the area of the tunnel. But I'm afraid it gets worse. The greater danger was disease. What was the great disease that was killing people in the 1830s, 1840s? Cholera. The greatest danger was disease. On July 16th of 1850, and no one had ever dug this up until I did, cholera spread among workers working on the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad tunnel south of Cowan. According to a story in the Winchester Independent, the first victim was a woman named Mrs. Mills, who died about a day after she fell ill. The second death was Edward Paul, a native of Cornwall, England, and one of the superintendents on the tunnel construction. He was a married man, and he expected his wife here today from Pennsylvania on today's stagecoach, the newspaper reported. By the time this item went to press, 6 other people died of cholera, including one child. On August 2nd, the Independent listed the names of 28 people. This is the Winchester newspaper, near the tunnel who died of disease, including 4 slaves and 6 children. However, the newspaper maintained that the town of Winchester, only 7 miles away, had escaped the scourge. It made no mention of law enforcement efforts the town would have made to keep diseased workers away from the town, although there's no doubt that there would have been some. they would have definitely posted armed guys with guns to say, don't come near here.
Wonder if they had masks.
No way. But they definitely would have shot to kill, if somebody had threatened to break it. So, then there were the accidents of a different sort. There were at least 5 train crashes on the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, even during the phase of its existence where only parts of it were open, which was remarkable considering how slowly the trains were moving. They were going like 15 miles an hour. And yet, have y'all heard of Overall Creek?
Yeah.
Is there a marker there that says this is the site of the first train crash? There should be. I told the principal about this, and he said, we've never heard of it. I'm like, well, if you go find the train track, find the creek, and I suspect there's remnants of a train down there. But this is the first train crash. The first accident took place in October 1851 when a locomotive, passenger car, and freight cars ran off the tracks at Overhaul Creek in Rutherford County. It is astonishing that not every person was killed, Banner reported. The only person who was killed was an African-American man, almost certainly an enslaved one whose name didn't even make the papers. Anyway, there were several of those. And at one point, there was a head-on collision, which does make you wonder, did they have any, like, were they just making this up? Okay, y'all head that way. You think that, so, everything that we have in this world, like procedures, like road, like we stay on the right side and the left side, we have 4-lane divided highways. Every bit of this was written in blood, okay? When we first had trains, they were crashing all over the place. And there were some letters where people said, that the train has been coming through here for some time, and I'm still not going to get on it. Like, well, I wonder why, because it was really dangerous. So on the one hand, the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad had its share of wonderful achievements. The first ride from Nashville to Antioch and the opening of the tunnel in Talon were great achievements. But it also encountered tragedies such as the cholera pandemic and the early train accidents. And it needs to be remembered that many of the men blasting rock, moving dirt, hauling logs into place, and hammering in rails were slaves, while many of the others were immigrants in a new land. The accidents, the delays, the epidemics, the labor problem, and the cost overruns, I didn't talk about those, the 20-minute version of a 40-minute talk, may account for the following. When Nashville was finally connected to Chattanooga, the newspapers treated it with more relief than celebration. On Saturday, January 15th of 1854, the locomotive known as the Tennessee crossed the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad Bridge over the Tennessee River just east of the town that later became known as Bridgeport, Alabama. The train rolled into Nashville 2 days later. That train was carrying cargo. What Tennessee product was the train carrying? Tobacco, cotton. These are good guesses, but you're wrong. Yes, it was carrying whiskey. The first train ever. I just thought that was funny. It even said that it was laden with whiskey from Middle Tennessee. I'm like, oh my God. Yeah, which is a former distillery that anyway, this is the article. This is it. This is the only article that I found in the Republican Banner. And it says freight trains from Nashville to Chattanooga pass through the entire route and over the bridge on the Tennessee on Saturday last. Passenger trains are now regularly running to also in sport, there will be uninterrupted communication by railroad between Nashville and Montgomery, Alabama, Charleston, and Savannah. Because by this time they were connector routes all over. What is a place that is not mentioned? Well, we mentioned Nashville, Montgomery, Charleston, and Savannah. It didn't exist yet. It wasn't even worth mentioning in 1850. Things would change really fast. But in 1854, Atlanta was like, if you do a search, you'll find that the name doesn't even appear, and then it kind of appears. It doesn't. When the Civil War started, Atlanta wasn't all that important. The reason it became large and important is Sherman leveled it, so they had to rebuild the whole thing. Anyway, this is the book, and if you have, I'm selling them for $25 each. Do you have any questions? I know it's 1 o'clock. Yes, sir.
The worst train wreck in American history, 1918.
Yep.
behind what we now know is St. Thomas West. The number of deaths has always been vague. Why?
I don't know. I'm not the expert on that. I do know a lot about this is a weird thing about Tennessee history. The worst train wreck ever to happen in American history happened in Tennessee. Where did the worst maritime accident? Outside of Memphis. Not this, it wasn't the Titanic, it was the Sultana. Oh, yeah. So Tennessee actually boasts the two deadliest. But I don't know. I know that there's a person who does walking tours. He will take you there. She probably knows more about it.
Like formed by the earthquake.
Yes.
And they say that they was told in Philadelphia. Earthquake. Philadelphia was famous.
Oh yeah, that earthquake
Right back.
was not one earthquake. There was a very clever man in Louisville who set up a series of pendulums. And according to that very clever man, there were 1,874 separate earthquakes between December of 1811 and March of 1812. There wasn't one, there were many. We don't know which one caused the Reelfoot Lake, but at some point afterward, they said, there's a lot of water here. It doesn't seem to be vanishing. For many years, like 10 or 20 years, the map makers would say flooded land. And that whole part of Tennessee, we eventually never really his Murfreesboro
Was another reason was the navigation. It's not very persons that come to.
Yep. Yes, ma'am.
Weren't all the Irish coming here because they were in trouble with the Irish potato famine? They
were coming to the United States. There were a number of railroads. Like they had their choice of like 7 railroad tunnels. There was an enormous amount of work. The Baltimore, Ohio was being built. This one was being built. The Memphis, Charleston was being built. So there were just a bottomless pit of jobs. Yeah, data fan was happening about that.
So they know the Irish potatoes in the spot.
Yeah.
I did some hiking in the Cornwall area of England a month ago. And they did a lot of mining there, and it was going out of fashion at this time. And that's why a lot of Irish people came to the United States, because we were building railroads.
I can see that.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for hearing. And all about the.
All right. If you want me to ruin it by signing it, I'll be glad to.
Check out.
Just to me.
Yeah, we are adjourned.